Hello everybody, I'm delighted to welcome you all to SACU's meeting, which is going to be a really interesting talk with Vince Cable. But first of all, I wanted to say this is one of our first attempts at a hybrid meeting. So I'm very pleased to welcome the people from Twickenham who've come in to be face-to-face. Vince said he likes to talk to humans as well as to screens, and we do too. So we're really pleased to be trying this method. So a little bit about SACU. So I'm the chair, and SACU has been around, the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, for more than 55 years now. And its mission is to build friendship and understanding between the peoples of China and the peoples of Britain. And so we're really keen to hear Vince's take on all this and his thoughts and ideas and understanding. So I think without further ado, I will introduce Vince and then go on to introduce his interviewer. So Vince, to us locals, is a completely known character. So in this room, we know him well because he was our MP for 2 stints, finishing in 2019. But as the leader of the Liberal Democrats also for that last 2 years. He was Secretary of State for Business Innovation Skills and also President of the Board of Trade for a period, and then Shadow Chancellor and Deputy Leader of the Lib Dems. So a big political career. Currently he's got an academic career, so he's a professor in practice at the Institute of Global Affairs at LSE and a visiting professor at the School of Economics in Nottingham. And he's also a visiting professor at the Institute of Business, Law and Society right here at St Mary's University. So Vince has come to this event because he knows Iris. Now Iris Yau is a SACU council member, but she's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce and a fellow of the Higher Education Academy in UK. Iris is described as an educator and a curator. I've certainly seen her curation work because she curated a really splendid exhibition called Opium, Silk and the Missionaries in China at the Brunei Gallery in SOAS. And she's also done one called Iris's Silk Route at the University of Arts in London. So we've got a really good pair here. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to seamlessly hand the microphone to Iris to do the housekeeping for those of us that are in this room. And then Iris and I will leave the stage, and Vince will have the floor to tell us about his book and his thinking. And then there's opportunity for Q&A from folks in the room and folks on the Zoom who will do clever things to type their questions in, and they will be conveyed to Iris. So Iris, over to you for the housekeeping. For those of us that are in here, in this lovely, cool room, we're very pleased to be here. And then over to Vince.
Hello everybody, many of us here. So very quick housekeeping. Fire, I've been told we're not expecting any fire drill. So in case of any fire alarm, one that way, and if you have mobile phone, can you please switch it off or put it on silent or on airplane mode? Another thing is very important is this event is recorded and we will be taking photographs. So if you are on social media, so the hashtag for Twitter or Facebook is SACU Public Event, SACU and Vince Cable and SACU. So Vince Cable is going to give a presentation about 25 minutes, and then we will be chatting as we have already got a lot of questions in. So I need to be very selective and make the most of this an hour time with Vince Cable. So over to you.
Well, thank you. And I hope this hybrid style works. But I should probably just start by explaining where I'm coming from. I mean, a lot of people get involved in China issues because of travel or cultural issues. My background was sort of economic, but I first started traveling to China 30 years ago. I was in Shell, I was their chief economist. They sent me out to do some due diligence work, I suppose, basically, looking at the future of the Chinese economy, helping them to make a decision on whether they should invest vast sums of money in the Guangzhou area, a big petrochemical complex. I got a bit of a feel then for some of the incredible dynamism that we're beginning to see in China. Then when I got into the government, my job was dealing with Chinese companies, dealing with Chinese government officials in China and here, building up trade in what President Xi called the golden era. And then when I lost my seat for a couple of years, I was looking around for things to do. And one of the jobs I got was working on the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. I did a collaborative project with some Nigerians on the impact of Chinese investment in Africa. And then more recently, since I retired from Parliament, I got involved in writing, basically, and this is the product, the Chinese Conundrum. And I was motivated to write it because what alarmed me really was that our very good working relationship with this enormously important country seemed to be in free fall. And there was a lot of hostility on both sides, mostly in the United States, but echoed in the UK. And I wanted to get my head around what all the arguments and all the issues were. My sort of approach to this is I'm not deeply knowledgeable about China. I don't speak the Chinese language and I've not lived there. And to say you're an expert on a country with 1.4 billion people would be absurdly presumptuous, even if I had those qualifications. And my approach to it isn't sort of sentimental. I mean, there are a lot of people who've been to China a lot, love it, and sort of totally unapologetic about it. My approach is much more hard-headed. I mean, I call it Nixonian realism. You remember Nixon went to China to break down the barriers under the time of Mao Zedong. And my starting point is that China is now an economic superpower. It is, I'll go on to develop that in a few minutes, but it's massively important for trade and investment and a lot of other things. And we just have to work with the Chinese authorities, whether we like it or not. I mean, I happen to think there are other positive things about China, but even if you don't have positive things about it, we have to have a working relationship. This is a bit of economic jargon, international public goods. What it means is that there are a whole lot of things which were shared problems. You know, climate change is the obvious one, pandemic management, nuclear proliferation, you know, problems of development in Africa, where we have a shared interest with China in solving those problems. And again, it's not a question whether it's good for us or good for them. We cannot solve these problems unless we work with the Chinese authorities on them. Also, I think the most difficult thing politically about China, I mean, a lot of Westerners got this idea that somehow or other, if China developed economically, it would somehow mushroom into some kind of Western democracy, and that this was never going to happen. And what the Chinese have demonstrated is that it's possible to be economically very, very successful without adopting the Western model of government. And, you know, so there have been some very difficult episodes along the way. I mean, Deng Xiaoping, who launched the reforms in China over 40 years ago, was arguably one of the great figures of history. I mean, he unleashed economic change, which has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. I mean, hardly anybody in history, possibly Roosevelt in the United States, bears some comparison, but hardly anybody about whom this could be said. But he was also a very hard man. I mean, he was a tough believer in one-party rule, the discipline of the Communist Party. He made the final decisions around the martial law and the Tiananmen Square events and so on. So, you know, this was successful capitalism without liberal democracy. It's a mix that a lot of people in the West find very difficult to live with. but it is the reality. Human rights is the issue which, as a politician, I constantly had raised in relation to China. I think the important thing here is that the Chinese talk about human rights a lot. It's not a subject they're afraid of. They just look at human rights in a different way. And if you go back over Chinese history, the last century, which are endless upheavals, enormous, horrific, civil wars, famine, the existence of stability and personal security, having a decent standard of living, these are major advances in human rights. Women having education, things of this kind. And the Chinese quite forcefully promote their concept of human rights, but it doesn't include the kind of things that people in the West regard as human rights. And there's a lot of mutual hostility and mutual misunderstanding over that point. And I would also stress that in looking at the future, it's currently massively uncertain. We just don't know what's going to happen. We think President Xi will get himself appointed for another period in office. We think it will continue more or less on the trajectory of the last few years, but we don't know. The attitude of the Americans is highly unstable. We've had Trump and now Biden. All kind of stuff could happen in American politics, and it would fundamentally change the approach to China. So what I've adopted, and I'll come to this at the end, is thinking about scenarios, different stories of the future. It's a technique we used in Shell because we recognized you can't predict the future 20 years ahead, so you have stories about it. Sorry, this to blind you with a bit of economics, but not really. But this is, I'm trying to simplify in a hopefully accessible way. Economic size. What is a big country, right? You keep hearing this phrase from British ministers who talk about Britain being the 5th biggest economy in the world. Some of it very misleading, actually, but it's this concept of a country having size. In other words, there's how much it produces, how much it consumes, the market. And see, Britain is actually down here. But the important thing is it's a contrast between the two bars, the blue and the orange. Now, the blue is the way that we normally see the world, which is that the United States has the biggest economy in the world by some measure. China is arguably number 2. China's economy is roughly the same size as that of the European Union. That's roughly how we normally see it. The problem with all this is that it's measured in a rather peculiar way. That the fact that if you're in China and you have the Chinese equivalent of $10, you can buy far more with your $10 than you can buy with $10 in the United States. This is called, in economics, the problem of purchasing power. So the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations have recalculated the size of economies to take account of this difference, differences in the level of prices. And what it shows is that China is now very substantially the biggest economy in the world, bigger than the United States. And number 3 is actually India, because India's size is vastly greater than you would realize by just sort of looking at a book from the GNP figures. So it's basically China, the USA, and India are now the 3 biggest economies in the world. Now, this is important not just from an academic point, but I think it affects the geopolitics, it affects the way we look at the world. The Americans are now very conscious that they are being overtaken or have been overtaken economically. And if you have a big economy, which the Chinese now have, they can do more with it, not just in terms of living standards, but investment, spending on weapons, amongst other things. And the Americans clearly regard this as very threatening to their traditional position of being numero uno, which And I think actually this underlies a lot of the xenophobia, at least at government level, certainly in the United States, which is this sense of China now emerging as the economic superpower. And using a bit of, simple bit of arithmetic logic, China has 4 times the population of the United States, about 1.4 billion. And currently its living standards are about a quarter of American levels and European levels. It's about sort of Thailand level on average, and that masks vast differences between the 300 or 400 million in the coastal areas who live at Western living standards and the people in the interior who are very, very poor. But the average is about Thailand, roughly. Now, were the Chinese to continue to advance, which they have been, let's say to Romanian levels of living standards, which is about half US levels, they would then have an economy which is twice the size of the United States. And you could see that that has enormous implications for the world and the way we look at the world. And I think that's what underlies much of the arguments about power relationships and not just simple economics. Of course, there's an awful lot more to our relationship with China than economic stuff, but one of the things I think we need to look at is the question is, will China continue to develop in the phenomenal way in which it's developed over the last 45 years? When Deng Xiaoping came to power after the death of Mao, he did push through these enormous reforms, basically more incentives for peasant farmers, opening up to trade, to foreign investments, and as a result, China is a country you recognize today. It's the biggest manufacturing country in the world, it's the biggest trading country in the world, attracts enormous amounts of inward investment. And until very recently, I think most people were very optimistic that China would just continue to motor ahead. But it's worth saying that it has problems of its own, bulls and bears, and there are people who are quite bearish about the future of China, and I think it's important to look at some of those sources of anxiety. The first is what's sometimes called the middle income trap, that quite a lot of middle income countries just get stuck. Argentina is a good example. First World War, Argentina was richer than Australia, Canada. It's just plummeted bad policy, mainly. A country like Turkey sort of got stuck in the middle. And there is an argument that China's now got to quite a difficult stage in its development. It will be quite difficult to progress to being a fully developed economy. And there is an expression the Chinese themselves use, of growing old before it's growing rich. Because what's happened is that as a consequence of the one-child policy, you've now got a population which is going to start declining. This is not unique to China. It's, Italy is declining really very rapidly. Japan. These are rich countries which have now got a declining population, shortage of labour, and in due course, a population in decline. And China is sort of heading in that direction because the one-child policy in a way was too successful. There's also a lot of worry about debt in China. There was this massive expansion which took place. People have never really credited China with the fact that after the financial crisis, 2008, what got me and the Dems into government in Britain in the 2010 election and the aftermath of the crisis, we got out of that crisis. We didn't have the world recession like in the 1930s, mainly because the Chinese had a phenomenal boom in construction. All these high-speed railways, the rebuilding of cities, it was phenomenal. It was said that they poured more cement in 3 years than United States had poured in the previous century. It was just a staggering boom in investment in infrastructure and housing and the rest. But the problem was that it left behind quite a lot of bad debt, because a lot of that money was carelessly used. And the kind of balance sheets in a lot of Chinese companies and local councils are stuffed with debt that they can't now service. And one particular manifestation of it is that there's been a giant property bubble which has burst. And you don't know where you saw it in the news, but there's the world's largest property company, which is called Evergrande. It's been teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. And although you don't normally associate China with demonstrations and sit-ins, there have been a lot of angry protests by Chinese consumers who are in danger of being caught up in this property bubble. This is a rather technical economic point, but China's been pouring enormous savings into investment, and it's not being well used. And they're going to have to become, because the population is drying up, they're going to have to use their investment now much more efficiently than they have in the past. We've got no evidence as to what will happen. And they have a model which I call state capitalism. It's theoretically communism, but actually there is a very large private sector. About half the economy is private enterprise, and ruthlessly efficient in many ways, ferociously competitive. And the other half are state enterprises, or semi-state enterprises, most of which mimic companies in the Western sense, some of which are kind of dinosaur-like state enterprises in the Northeast, though there's a gradually decline. But there are limits to this kind of state-controlled but free enterprise-operated economy. And we've seen this coming to a head in the last year, and the president has launched his campaign to curb the power of the big internet companies. We have Facebook, Google, and Amazon, and the Chinese have the same, Chinese branded, Chinese owned, actually in some ways bigger than ours. But those companies became extremely powerful. Were beginning to flex their muscles in China, and the president has essentially tried to curb their power. But they were also the companies driving a lot of the innovation and growth in China. So they're walking quite a narrow tightrope. But at the same time, the country is liberalizing. It's opening markets. One of the interesting developments in the last year is that China's thrown open its door to the big Western banks. JP Morgan, BlackRock, the wealth managers have just been invited into China to operate freely. And there's a whole new generation of Chinese billionaires going through the system. There are estimated to be, a couple of years ago, 870 billionaires in China. Some of them fell foul of the government, one or two were shot, many alleged corruption. But at the same time, large numbers of new companies are opening up in new enterprises backed by the government, and there are probably over now 1,000 billionaires in China. So you've got this incredibly dynamic free enterprise system coexisting with a very powerful state. I think the only precedents we've had before were in Korea. Maybe Japan was a bit like this at an earlier stage. And more recently, in the last 2 years, a preoccupation with economic security. And this is a worry about American sanctions, that the world is splitting into two. The Chinese are building up their own internal technology, independence of the Western system, decoupling from Western companies because they believe that the West is decoupling from them. So it's become a kind of vicious circle. And this is, it partly influences the way I've seen, our own government and our own businesses looking at China. Well, I think 10 years ago, it was seen as a kind of El Dorado. you know, these 1.4 billion consumers who can rush into China and make lots of money. It was propelled by kind of a bit of greed, but China was seen as an opportunity. And now increasingly you see much more negative arguments, China seen as a threat. Various things to be said about it. For a long time, America and China coexisted. Basically, what happened was that the Americans ran very large deficits in their budget, which they financed with Chinese savings. So the Chinese held vast quantities of dollars, they still do. And it was called a kind of balance of terror, because if the Chinese had dumped all their dollars, it would have caused a big crisis. But of course, the Chinese would also have lost the value of their money. So they've been locked together in what the Professor Neil Ferguson called Chin America, a kind of integrated system. And so far that's held. Then Trump came along complaining about unfair trade, accusing China of what he called economic rape, which is a bit offensive, I think. But it was an emotional reaction to the fact that Chinese were proving extremely successful in international trade. And he built up this antagonism between the American workers and Wall Street, arguing that Chinese competition was depriving all the steel workers of their jobs and so on. And so we had tariffs. You get a lot of companies, including British companies, complaining that Chinese enterprises steal their technological ideas, and there was quite a bit of that happen, as there had earlier been with Japan and Korea. And back in the 19th century, the United States was parroting other people's technologies, British technology in those days. But nonetheless, this is, I think, passing, because China is now ahead of the world in terms of telecommunications technology and quite a few other areas, but it's a grievance. Now, particularly with the Ukraine war, worry about supply and increasing anxiety about supplies of semiconductors, the use of rare earth minerals as a kind of economic weapon. And so you're getting also this kind of new Cold War mentality where security takes precedence over economic advantage and trade and investment, which was the world we had 10 years ago. And so you're getting what I call decoupling happening. The West and China deeply integrated, but now this beginning to unstitch to the point where people are now talking in China of a phrase called the Great Split, in which they're going to sail off into the sunset and create their own world with the large numbers of countries which trade predominantly with them, and then the West will go off in its own direction. It hasn't happened, but you can see quite a lot of elements of that. Tariffs going up in the United States, Huawei being excluded from the UK and other countries. Trump tried to kick out TikTok, he didn't succeed, fell down in the courts. But a lot of worry about supply of semiconductors. The biggest factory in the world is actually in Taiwan, which is in the middle of a potential battlefield. You know, it's obviously a certain anxiety about that. So the Americans, the Europeans, the Chinese now desperately trying to build up their semiconductor supplies. The sanctions that were imposed after the demonstrations in Hong Kong and the crackdown. And what is beginning to happen now is that Chinese companies listing in the United States trying to raise capital are being blocked, partly on the Chinese side, partly on the American side. And something that occurred is really now beginning to alarm people, that the big sanctions that against Russia that's worked in the case of Ukraine is that China and Russian companies can no longer exchange their currencies. So, for example, if they export oil, it's very difficult to make a transaction work through the international payment system, which is the SWIFT system, which is used for all international trade and financial transactions. And the Chinese are worried stiff that this is now going to apply to them. And then there's this whole antagonism and bad feeling that's arising through the Ukraine war. The Chinese accused of backing the Russians, which they are in rhetoric, but they haven't actually done anything. They abstained in the voting, like countries like India, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and others. But there is, and I'll just finish up on this point, that we've got now a mixture of politics and economics and the language of what's called a new Cold War. You know, why has this happened? You know, I was in government just over 5 years ago, and the Chinese and the British government were the best of friends, and yet suddenly we find ourselves in a Cold War environment. Why has this soured so harshly? And there's a mixture of things. I mean, I think COVID didn't help. Trump's campaign blaming the Chinese virus. I mean, you know, we know there's a history there, but it certainly penetrated public opinion. And what's happening now, of course, is the Chinese, frankly, making a mess of the COVID strategy by refusing to use Western vaccines. The problem with that is that China is now a closed country. It's impossible virtually to get in and out. So people are not talking to each other. What used to happen until very recently, I think 130 million Chinese used to go abroad every year, studying, tourism, shopping, whatever, visiting their friends and relatives, and then going back. It wasn't a closed country like the old Soviet Union, but now it's not happening because of COVID. Then we've got this, what I call an unholy alliance. The Trump people, the new hardline neocons, the sort of right-wing Republicans, and what I call liberals, not necessarily my party, but liberal-minded people who are antagonistic to China because of human rights issues. And there's now virtually nobody speaking up and saying we need to have good relations with China. There's a kind of alliance on the other side. We're now getting a kind of Asian NATO, which is partly explains why the Chinese have taken up this position on the Ukraine war, with an alliance, United States, UK, Australia, Japan, possibly India, and Vietnam, which is also a communist country, but is closely aligned with the West when it relates to China. Europe is a bit ambiguous. The French and Germans have traditionally favored having a very strong commercial relationship with China, but recently in a big argument with Lithuania over recognition of Taiwan, the European Union has swung behind Lithuania and against China, and you get a hardening of attitudes in Europe. And then there are these incendiary issues, particularly around the Uyghurs, Xinjiang. We're all talking at cross purposes in many ways, where the Chinese said that this is a matter of our territorial integrity, this is part of China, this is our business, nothing to do with you. And the West saying it is to do with us, universal values, we're going to tell you about, you've got to improve your behavior or we're going to have sanctions. So there's a bitter hostility based really on an argument about fundamentally different starting points. And then, you know, the growing influence of China, much of it perfectly legitimate commercial interests in Africa and Latin America, but it clearly scares the Western countries who are used to dominating here. And actually, even countries like Saudi Arabia are now trading much more with China than the West and building up a relationship which is causing a growing worry about alliances and what side different countries are on. Then the Ukraine war. And then lastly, the thing which is giving a lot of people nightmares is that the long-standing issues around Taiwan break out into open warfare. I mean, I would really say that this has been an issue for 70 years, at least. Nothing has happened. China's had a very long pragmatic relationship with Taiwan. People go backwards and forwards, companies go backwards and forwards. When I last went to China, I was taken on a tour of an enormous industrial complex called Foxconn, which happens to be a Taiwanese company in China. And moreover, the Chinese have shown no sign of preparing for an invasion, but at the same time they talk about it. And there's this sort of constant low-level buzzing of aircraft, which leads some people to believe that we're heading to conflict. And if it did, then we've got, Ukraine cubed. But so far, unfortunately, that hasn't yet happened. And I'm sketching here some of the build-up of political and economic problems which have led to all this talk about a new Cold War. There is a positive side, which we'll go on to talk about in questions, but I thought I'd sketch how we've got where we are, and then maybe this is my final slide. And it goes back to the kind of approach I adopted in Shell, which is trying to think about the future. And the way to think about the future is through fundamentally different stories about how it could evolve. And what I've done is I've sketched on economies between China being very open to the world, integrated in the world, and very closed. And on the other, the geopolitics, China being very welcomed, cooperation, and here seen as an adversary, as an enemy. And out of that, I've got three stories, one of which I call Davos China, which is, I think, where we were really to a couple of years ago, where relationships are seen as a kind of win-win. We can cooperate, it's very much in our mutual interest. And it's good for everybody, and that's what was happening. And you look around British business, that's how a lot of them see it. AstraZeneca, Jaguar Land Rover, making pots of money in China, very happy with their situation. And a lot of Chinese companies doing very well in the West. So that's the Davos world. What I call Sparta is, after an increasingly popular theory in the United States, that what you're getting is something a bit like the Peloponnesian Wars in ancient Greece, where Sparta and Athens were at conflict, more or less perpetual warfare. This is seen as a kind of zero sum, that one country can't advance without the other being disadvantaged, in which we're worried about security, not about economic advance. And it is a world of conflict. And so I have to say in the last 2 years, we're more there than there. But I did have a third possibility, which I call Ming China. Those of you who know your Chinese history will know that there was a phase in the Ming dynasty when Admiral Hay was exploring the Indian Ocean, Africa, Middle East, India. China's had these phenomenal naval fleets which dwarfed anything that Magellan and Columbus were putting together. And then more or less overnight, the emperor and his court decided this was not in China's interest. There was no benefit from it. Closed the whole thing down. The boats were burnt, and China turned inward. And you can envisage a situation in which the economy struggles, they get caught up in this middle income trap, can't get out of it, and hostility externally as well leads them to retreat and become much more inward-looking. There's a bit of a parallel with what's happened in recent years with Japan. If you remember, 30 years ago, everybody used to talk about Japan taking over the world, and these slightly paranoid stories about Japanese business. But then the Japanese had a complete economic collapse when their bank system went down. And China's muddled along, and Japan's muddled along and not done too badly. But they've disappeared. We no longer talk about Japan anymore. And it could be that we have that story with China. So I don't know which of these or some other variant will happen, but I think we just need to have an open mind about possible different futures. But thank you for this. That's where I exceeded my time.
I did give you 5 more minutes. So, but then, it's all ours. We got a lot of questions, so I need to be even more selective. I just want to remind people why we're here. Can you see this? Remember this with the table? So are you pleased? I'm not lobbying you at the Parliament this time. So you're very relaxed now. So, okay. So I got your book. You can see, as you can see, I did my homework. It's ups and down. And like you said, the last chapter is your 3 scenarios. So I need to fast forward. So many questions, but then I think this I had to ask, if not, I'll be in trouble. In your book, you did, it's very informative, and you did, give a brief history about the China last golden age, from the Ming Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, the Silk Road, and we just mentioned, we have the Chancellor is from Song and Ming Dynasty. In Cantonese, is Dems Hoi. It's very famous. So advanced the technology, and then you talk about the downfall, and then also the open up. It was in your presentation, and then this Red Scare from America, from Joseph McCarthy. And I need to ask this question, just take this opportunity. For me, as a person with Chinese heritage, what are your views on why the rise on xenophobia?
Yes, quite a few of my Chinese friends worry that there is a hostility to them because they are Chinese. I have to say, I mean, I'm not Chinese myself, so I'm not on the receiving end of it, but I get a sense that this is probably not a big issue in the UK. Maybe I'm wrong, but I deal with a lot of Chinese students at the LSE and elsewhere, and they don't, basically they say the country's quite friendly, but you do encounter drunks on a Saturday night, and sometimes racial prejudice is there, but it's not a big issue in the UK. It is in the United States, I think. There's been a lot of examples of Chinese students, researchers being singled out for attacks, and also researchers in universities accused of spying and things of this kind. And I think it's much more of an issue in the United States than it is here. But of course, the relationship between governments is rather different between the relationship between individuals. I've actually talked about this subject to Boris Johnson, who is quite interested in China. He describes himself as not a xenophobic, but as a Sinophile. He's a great admirer of China and Chinese civilization, and he wants to make our relationship better. And I think he's sincere, actually. And so at government level, I don't think that there is British hostility. The problem is that since, I'm sorry to be political about it, but since Brexit, we've now become much more heavily dependent on the United States. We're #1 ally. The United States has stepped up its Cold War with China, and we've been dragged along with it. A very good example is what happened to Huawei. I dealt with Huawei extensively when I was in the cabinet. It's one of the companies I had some responsibility for. And we had a good working relationship. They were dealing with some very sensitive security type communications, but our people were satisfied that there was no problem. When Theresa May wanted to upgrade the telecommunications infrastructure to 5G, she came up with a perfectly sensible compromise, which was that Huawei should stay in Britain, build up base stations, improve our telecoms, but the very sensitive defense-related things, they should not be allowed in. But then what was discovered was that because of American sanctions on Huawei, Britain couldn't get access to the chips, highly specialized semiconductors that were needed for the telecom system. So what we were going to get was from China that wasn't secure. And so our people decided to tell Huawei to go away. But it was not essentially British xenophobia. I think it was driven by our alliance with the United States.
Okay, I'm going to jump to another question because you talk about Boris Johnson, government. So in recent years, there has been an upsurge in hostility, or at least negative view towards China among MPs from all parties. What practical things do you think can be done to help to change that?
Well, you're right. The atmosphere in Parliament is very, very negative. And it comes from two sources. One are Conservative MPs in what's called the China Research Group, which is a bit like the European Research Group, and they're very well organised. Ian Duncan Smith, I think, is the convener of it. And it is very hostile to China on a mixture of grounds. But it's equally true that the Lib Dems and Labour have become very hostile, almost entirely on human rights grounds. And the issue of the Uyghurs is often cited as a reason for hostility, for that Tibet. My experience of dealing with human rights issues in China is that if you raise them in the right way, it's possible to have a dialogue. When I first went to China with the coalition government, with David Cameron, there was strong requests, mainly from Nick Clegg, actually, to have the issue of Tibet raised. And so we told the Chinese, we're going to raise the issue of Tibet. They said, well, I don't want to talk about it, but okay, you talk about it, you say what you want to say, we will give our reply, you put out your press releases, we'll put out our press releases, and then we got on and talked about other things. I think providing it was clear that we were not just going there to try and humiliate the government and just score debating points, that genuinely raise an issue and have a properly grown-up conversation, it wasn't a problem. But what's happened since Biden came into office, the first thing that happened was a really aggressive approach to human rights, centering on the Uyghur issue, very public, before any engagement had taken place with the Chinese authorities. And so the Chinese authorities planned that. They regard this as an anti-terrorist operation. The West regards it as a serious human rights abuse. And we just exchange bad words. And it's acted as a barrier to any other kind of discourse.
You talk about the new Cold War, in the presentation. So what are the dangers of the US Cold War on China, especially in a world facing climate chaos and economic turbulence? Is it your view that global cooperation is better than division and conflicts?
Yes, I want to see proper engagement, grown-up relationships between Western countries and China. The dangers are extreme. I mean, we could drift into a war situation. It could arise around Taiwan, or it could arise around other things. Relations with China and Japan are pretty terrible. And there is an enormously rapid arms race. Until very recently, the Chinese didn't spend a high percentage of their economy on defense. Very unlike the Soviet Union, they spent about 2% of GDP, which is the same as the UK. Their armed forces were improving, but they weren't exceptionally large, concentrated mainly on the Navy. But within the last 2 years, there is a sense that relations are deteriorating badly. The Chinese are really concentrating hard on building up their armed forces. We've had a big growth in nuclear warheads, on delivery systems, hypersonic weapons. and the Americans in turn building up their systems. So you've got a kind of, you know, an arms race taking place, which could potentially finish up in a very bad place. So that's the extreme danger. Even if that doesn't happen, you've got the unpicking of economic relationships, which is bound to make everybody poorer off. And we can see this already. The alternative is that we do recognize that there are areas of common interest. One of the good things that came out of that otherwise rather depressing COP summit in Glasgow on climate was that although the Chinese were being attacked for not being there and, you know, not doing anything, actually they're doing quite a lot, but was that there was a joint memorandum between John Kerry, the American climate negotiator, and the Chinese equivalent, recognizing that they were the two countries with the biggest responsibility for climate and curbing emissions, and that they needed to work together to solve the issue. And the Chinese are, they've got a lot of coal burning, but they're also the most rapidly developing renewable power in the world. I gather that more investment has taken place in wind in China in the last year than in the whole of the rest of the world for the last 5 years. It sounds a bit unlikely, but I gather that is the case. China is also embarking on a massive expansion of electric vehicles, which are soon going to be flooding Western markets, actually. They've really got the car industry on the scruff of the neck. And so, you know, electric vehicles are going to come primarily through Chinese models. So in some respects, you know, China is way out on climate issues, and we've got to engage. You know, it is, after all, affects the future of all of us.
I got a few more questions, but I don't think we can finish it. I don't think we can take questions from the audience, sorry, or Zoom, but we will answer the question later. I will email you. But then these two questions I have to ask you. What are the consequences if we continue to have conflicts with China?
Well, I think I partly just answered that. Turn the question around the other way. How do we turn it into a better situation? I think the first is, you know, partly through the business relationships. I mean, I have lots of dealings in government with AstraZeneca, the people who developed the vaccine. A lot of the profits that we used to finance the vaccine development were made in China. Jaguar Land Rover's highly successful car industry is based largely on its Chinese business. So if we continue to advertise and build up those China connections, I feel probably people will take a more nuanced view about China. To take another topical example, on Sunderland, or the big new project which is taking place, building up a battery factory to supply the future of electric vehicles, is Chinese owned. There is a network of Chinese owned battery plants happening across the UK. British universities, including those I'm involved in, depend very heavily on Chinese students, both educationally and financially. So, you know, there is real mutual benefit here, which is what we should be trying to preserve.
Yeah, I'm in higher education. I know you got this figure in your book. The Chinese student, international student, paid some 7 billion on 2003. But, you know, in general, the international student, they spend 26 billion every year, you know, including accommodation, everything. Is a big business. So in a way, how can we really cooperate and then grow this business? Because, you know, it's in huge demand. Even the COVID, it doesn't really stop them coming. So this is certainly something we need to, you know, really work better. And that leads to my, you know, other question, probably the last one, I'm afraid. So what, you know, yeah, you did mention in your book and the presentation, you have 3 scenarios. Can I ask you which scenario you're in favor?
Well, Well, the world that when I was closely involved with the Chinese government and business, it was very much what I call the Davos world. It was a hard-headed business connections on both sides. And you know, I believe in general in economic integration leads to better political relations. You could say that Brexit rather disproves that, but in general, it's the case that closer economic links bind the countries closer together. So I want to see that, what I call Davos China. The Sparta world is really too frightening to contemplate.
So what do you think the next step towards this Davos scenario, engagement, cooperation?
Well, that would be my personal world, but I fear that politically, I encounter very few people in the UK in the political world who now want to build up a relationship with China. It's become very a bad thing to be associated with. And I had a group of students that actually tried to get me kicked out because I had spoken up for engagement.
We will kick you out. Lovely. We only got a few minutes. I have to. Is there any question we want to ask here? You know, maybe we should. You know, you make all the way here.
We can ask after the Zoom is finished.
Yeah. So we will just take it. Okay. Don't say I didn't ask. Yeah, I did try to include you. So I'm afraid we're really running out of time. So thank you for all the audience tuning in. Thank you for all you coming. As I said, we will pass our question to Ms. Cable, and then we will get a reply and then pass it back to you. Myself, may I say, of course, I'm in favor of the Davos China scenario. I remember our president, Michael Wood, we did a webinar, I think last year or 2 years ago. So this is what he said, you know, we need cooperation, we need this understanding. It's for the well-being of the world. It's not just for business, just for one party, one company, or one industry. It's really for the well-being of the whole world. So of course, I'm in favor of in that. And I hope we can really turn the tide, you know, just like the golden era, is it era? So thanks again, Ms. Cable. And I have to say, thank you for all the volunteers, especially Aaron. He did all this running around, get this tag, you know, up and running. If not, we won't be able to do this in-person event. And also, SACU is a charity run entirely by volunteers. So please join us. This is a time, it's difficult, and then we need more cooperation to promote friendship and understanding and horizon. Yeah. So join us, support us. If you don't join as a membership, you can always share our video event, or look at what we have got, social media. So like us, follow us, and then let's make a positive difference together. And that's it. Yeah, is that okay? Thank you, Ms. Hibbert.